So let me ask you something. Have you ever faced a problem that just felt unsolvable? I mean, a flaw so deep in the system it feels like the laws of physics themselves are rigged against you? Well, in the middle of the biggest war in human history, American pilots were dealing with exactly that, every single day. And the story of how they solved it with a tiny, almost insignificant piece of metal is about way more than just an airplane. It's a lesson in how the simplest ideas can be the most powerful. Okay, let's get into it. I want you to put yourself in the cockpit. It's August 14th, 1944. You're 23,000 feet over Germany. You're a German pilot, and you've got a P-38 Lightning on your tail. So you do what you've been trained to do, what has worked every single time for 3 years. You roll over and push the stick forward into a screaming high-speed dive. It's your guaranteed escape plan. Any Allied plane that tries to follow you will literally tear itself apart. But on this day, something is wrong. Something is terrifyingly wrong. You look over your shoulder, and the P-38 is still there. Not just there, it's in perfect control, and it's still firing. For that pilot and for the entire German Air Force, the fundamental rules of air combat were just rewritten right in front of their eyes. The big question was, how?
To understand what changed, we first got to talk about the plane at the center of all this, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. And man, what a machine. It looked like something out of a sci-fi comic book. Twin engines, twin tails, and a nose packed with cannons and machine guns. It was fast, it was powerful, it was futuristic. But it had a dirty little secret, a fatal flaw hidden deep in its DNA that was discovered entirely by accident. A flaw that made it predictable, and for a smart enemy, completely beatable.
And here's the absolute core of the problem. We usually think a plane's limit is its engine, right? How much power it has. Well, the P-38 was hitting a totally different kind of wall, a wall made of air. In these high-speed dives, pilots would suddenly find their controls just froze. They couldn't pull up. The plane's nose would just keep dropping, pulling them into an even faster, steeper, and ultimately fatal dive. They were literally flying too fast for their own wings, hitting a barrier made not by the enemy, but by pure physics. And this terrifying phenomenon had a name: compressibility. So let's break down this invisible force, because it's kind of mind-bending. When a plane is flying, the air has to travel faster over the curved top of the wing than the flat bottom. Now, in a dive, as the plane picks up incredible speed, that air flowing over the wing can actually accelerate all the way to the speed of sound, even when the plane itself hasn't. When that happens, bam, a shockwave forms right on the wing. And we're not talking about sound you can hear. This is a violent, invisible disruption in the airflow that completely wrecks the wing's aerodynamics. Let's walk through this chain reaction, because this is the anatomy of the pilot's nightmare. It starts with the dive. As the plane screams downwards, those shockwaves form on the wings. And here's the critical part. Those shockwaves cause the wing's center of pressure, the main spot where lift is being generated, to shift way back. All of a sudden, the elevators on the tail, the controls that are supposed to lift the nose up, they become useless. They're just flapping in the wind. The nose is then forced down by this huge aerodynamic imbalance, and the pilot is now just a passenger in a multi-ton lawn dart pointed at the ground.
Now, this wasn't just some random glitch. Oh no, it became a known exploitable weakness. German intelligence was incredibly good. By piecing together combat reports and interrogating downed Allied pilots, they figured out the P-38's Achilles heel. And they didn't just know about it, they turned that knowledge into a standard, life-saving tactic. It became official doctrine for every Luftwaffe pilot.
And this slide right here lays out the brutal, tactical reality. A German pilot gets into a fight he can't win, he just rolls over and dives. It was his get-out-of-jail-free card. But the American pilot, he faced an impossible choice. Let the enemy just fly away to fight another day, or follow him into a dive that could very well kill you, even without the enemy firing a single bullet. This wasn't a fair fight. You were literally fighting your own airplane. And this is where the psychological damage comes in, which you could argue was even worse. For a fighter pilot, confidence is everything. That aggressive edge is what keeps you alive. But when you know for a fact that your enemy has a foolproof escape plan, you start to hesitate. You second-guess yourself. You pull back. As this quote says, you know your quarry can escape at will. And so morale in P-38 squadrons across Europe just plummeted. The best plane in the world means nothing if your pilots are afraid to push it.
But while all this was happening over Europe, back in the US, a team at Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, led by the absolute genius Kelly Johnson, was already on it. They were locked in a desperate race, not against another country, but against the very laws of aerodynamics. They knew that if they couldn't solve compressibility, the P-38's career as a top-tier fighter was basically over.
And the solution they came up with,
It was pure genius in its simplicity. They didn't need to redesign the whole plane, they didn't need more horsepower, they just needed to manage the airflow. So they developed these small flaps on the underside of the wing. When a pilot deployed them, they'd pop out and disrupt the shockwave from forming. And this is the key. They'd shift that center of pressure forward again, giving the pilot back control of his plane. It was an incredibly tiny fix for a massive, deadly problem.
But finding the solution is only half the battle. Getting it to the troops was a heartbreaking ordeal. Look at this timeline. They proved the flaps worked all the way back in February 1943. By early '44, they had over 200 retrofit kits ready to ship to Europe. The fix was on its way. And then, absolute disaster. In March of 1944, the transport plane carrying every single one of those kits was accidentally shot down by a British fighter pilot who mistook it for a German bomber. An entire year of progress, hundreds of kits, all gone in a plume of smoke over the English Channel. The delay was devastating, and pilots kept dying for months because of it. Despite that catastrophic setback, they didn't give up. They had to restart production. And by the late summer of 1944, new P-38s with the dive flaps built in at the factory, along with new kits, finally started to arrive in Europe. And almost overnight, the entire landscape of the air war began to change.
Getting the hardware there was just step one. Now you had to convince the pilots, whose trust in this plane was shattered. So Lockheed sent their legendary test pilot, a guy named Tony LeVier, on a tour of P-38 bases. You can just imagine it, a crowd of skeptical pilots standing on the airfield, arms crossed. LeVier takes a new P-38 up to 25,000 feet, and then he does the one thing they'd all been told was suicidal. He puts it into a full-power vertical dive. Everyone on the ground must have held their breath, expecting a crater. But then, smooth as silk, LeVier pulls out. And to really drive the point home, he does a few low-level victory rolls over the field. He was showing them, not telling them. Your plane is no longer a death trap. It's a weapon without limits.
And you can hear the difference in the voices of the pilots themselves. A guy named Robin Olds, who would go on to become a triple ace. He flew both versions. He described the absolute sheer terror of being in an old P-38 when compressibility hit, fighting the controls with all his strength. But then, he flew the new models with the flaps. He said the difference was night and day. Suddenly, he could point that nose wherever he wanted, at any speed, with total confidence. The fear was gone, and it was replaced by a renewed feeling of complete dominance.
So LeVier's air show brought morale roaring back, and pilots like Robin Olds proved the fix worked in combat. But what was the actual measurable impact on the war? Well, let's look at the numbers, because they are truly staggering. Think about how simple this was in the heat of battle. A pilot feels that telltale buffet, the shudder that used to mean he was about to die. Now, he just flips a switch on his control stick. In 1.5 seconds, the flaps deploy, and he has instant total control back. For a life-or-death problem, that is an unbelievably fast and elegant solution. But here's the number that really matters: 260. Based on the loss rates before the fix, it's estimated this simple modification saved 260 aircraft from being lost. And more importantly, that's 260 trained, experienced pilots who got to fly again and who got to go home. That is an enormous impact. And this chart just shows you the whole story visually. Before the flaps, look at that high bar. The vast majority of German fighters who dove away got away. It was a sure thing. After the flaps arrive, look at that bar drop. The escape rate just plummeted. The P-38 could now stick to them like glue through any dive at any speed. Their sanctuary was officially closed for business. The bottom line is this: the rules of the game were permanently changed. That dive was no longer an escape, it was a trap. For German pilots who had relied on this tactic for years, their one guaranteed safety net was now the very thing that would ensure their destruction. The tables hadn't just been turned, they had been completely flipped over. You know, the story of the dive flap is way more than just a fascinating piece of World War II history. It's really a powerful case study in problem-solving and innovation under extreme pressure, with lessons that echo all the way to today. And these takeaways are just timeless, aren't they? Think about it. While Germany was pouring resources into so-called wonder weapons that were often too late and too few, the Allies were making these practical, incremental fixes. The dive flop wasn't some futuristic jet engine, but it had a decisive, immediate impact on the battlefield. It really proves that sometimes the most effective innovation isn't some giant moonshot, but a small, clever fix to a critical problem that you truly understand. And the legacy of this program, it didn't stop in 1945. Because they were so focused on solving this problem, they generated a mountain of useful data on transonic flight, that really tricky area near the speed of sound. That knowledge was immediately applied to other fighters, like the P-47 Thunderbolt, and it was absolutely crucial for the engineers who were designing the first supersonic aircraft. So when Chuck Yeager famously broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1, he was, in a very real way, benefiting from the hard lessons learned by P-38 pilots in the skies over Germany.
And that really brings it all back to us, doesn't it? We all face our own compressibility moments, problems that seem so overwhelming, so fundamental, that it feels like we're fighting against physics itself. And the story of the P-38 dive flap is this powerful reminder that the solution might not be some massive, complex overhaul. It might just be an elegant, simple fix, a small adjustment that restores control and changes the entire dynamic of the problem. So the question I want to leave you with is this: what's the simple flap you're not seeing?